Welcome to you all as well on my behalf. And what I would like to talk to you about is predicting the future. And first of all, I would like to ask you a question. Who thinks he can predict the future? Good. I see two people. Later on in the break, I will join you because I need some advice on my stock investment portfolio. That's really great. But most of us just can't. And that's a pity. Wouldn't it be nice if we could? And well, if you look at that, my main advice of today would be to never trust anyone who says he can predict the future, especially not if he's being paid for it. And there are famous examples of that, of course. If you look at Wall Street, they did an experiment with a chimpanzee. He was throwing darts to randomly select stocks to invest in. And they compared this to very well-paid stock analysts in their advices. And well, the result was quite disappointing in the sense that the chimpanzees performed as well as the stock analysts did. So the saying is that if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. But if you pay a very well salary, well, you get stock analysts, but the result in the end is the same, only you have higher costs. Well, that's of course a joke, but one thing is that these people have in common, and they dislike being reminded of the predictions they did in the past about the future, because in most cases they were just dead wrong. So again, be very critical about it. We have some famous examples of that. If we look at the entertainment industry, there was one person working at Decca Records who thought he was an expert on future trends in music, and he was convinced that guitar music would become obsolete, and therefore they decided to reject the Beatles. And well, a bit pity, they sold 800 million copies afterwards, so that was probably a decision he regrets, I assume. And the same, of course, goes for the Harry Potter manuscript. There were 12 publishers who rejected it. And the reason for that, if you look at it, is that they said, well, fantasy is on its return. It won't be as popular as Tolkien was, etc. And the value of the Harry Potter franchise is now estimated at billions of dollars. Ooh. So maybe you can go back in your memory and think about what your reaction was when, for instance, the internet was introduced. What did you think? Did you think, oh, right away, this is a useful thing? I can tell you, based on research, that many people thought it would not become relevant, especially search engines. And so, why would you have to search for information or buy things online? What's the use of that? And again, with the introduction of mobile phones, lots of people thought, well, I don't see myself using that device in the future. What's the use of it? Well, I think that if you compare it to today, we're using it quite often. And the same goes, for instance, for electric cars. Some 10 years ago, the petrol heads at car manufacturers in Germany and Italy and France were all laughing out loud when Tesla introduced its first electric car. And well, that's not the future. If you look currently at the Dutch market, the #1 selling lease car is now the Tesla Model 3. And they're quite panicking in countries such as Germany. So that's how it is. So why is that so difficult? Well, actually, if you look at research, you can see that there are 6 factors that are relevant for us being unable to predict the future. One of them is speed. What's most visible to us are the more superficial, short-cycled changes. And by focusing on that, we forget about the changes that are more profound, but develop very slowly. For instance, climate change, it stays unnoticed for a very long time until it reaches a certain threshold, and then the impact is really profound. but we didn't see it coming because it stays under our radar, so to speak. Another thing is paradigms. That's just an agreement we have informally with each other in how we think the world works. And everyone who comes up with arguments that contradicts our view is being laughed away mostly. A famous example of that is, of course, Copernicus, who many years ago came up with the idea that the sun wasn't circling the Earth, but it was the other way around. He introduced the heliocentric model, but people were really angry at him because how could he come up with such a nonsense idea? So that doesn't help. Thirdly, our brain really likes linear processes. And we aren't very well able to look at the future and think about exponential developments. A famous example of that is, for instance, DNA sequencing. They started that in the 1980s, and at that time the academics were quite convinced that it was an utopia. It would never be that we could sequence persons' DNAs. And if so, it would at least take 30 to 40 years to achieve that. And then with the computer power growing following Moore's law, it accelerated. And then in 7 years' time, they had their first breakthrough. What meant that they were able to sequence DNA, but it took some years per person, and it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nowadays, you can have your DNA sequenced in just a few hours, and it costs less than 70 euros. So we're not very well able to do that. Another thing is coincidence, unexpected things. For example, Lehman Brothers in 2008, they had a surplus of $60 billion in possession in comparison to their debts, but it did go bankrupt, and in doing so, it triggered a series of events which led to our financial crisis. Well, how can you predict something like that? And that also has to do with complexity. I won't go into detail on that, but it's actually about chaos theory in the sense that all developments intertwine. They influence each other. In that theory, people say that it could be possible that a fly in Brazil could cause a hurricane in Texas. And how can you cope with that in thinking about the future? Finally, knowledge, which is limited. There's lots of things that we don't know. And the hardest thing about that is that we don't know what we don't know. That makes it a bit complex, probably, but think about that. And one of the other things in this aspect is that we tend to forget things, in the sense that talking about that financial crisis and the dot-com boom and all the problems afterwards during the change of the millennium, people had forgotten about what happened in 1929, the stock market crash in America, which triggered all of the same effects that we have experienced quite recently. And I'm convinced that future generations will go and make the same mistakes again because they don't know anymore. So that makes it difficult. And going back to that aspect of speed, just one question. At a certain point in time, Bell had invented the telephone. How many years do you think that it took to reach 50 million users of the telephone? Call out, how many years?
75 years, maybe.
75, hey, you know your basics. Yeah, you're right. That's great. And the radio, do you know it as well?
40, something like that?
Yeah, it's 38. Yeah. It's 38. Thanks. You've done your homework. Yeah. And another question, Pokemon Go, 50 million euros? How
60 days.
It was 5 days, actually. You can see it here. And what you see here are two effects coming together. One is the existence of internet, connecting everything with each other. And the other thing is what you call software is eating the world. By software, I mean everything that's not hardware. And so it's not just program code, it's also intellectual property, knowledge. It's also services sometimes. And that software behaves differently than hardware. It doesn't follow the laws of in which place and time are relevant. So without any cost and time loss, you can move it from one place to another and duplicate it there. And that's why speed is increasing, and we are all facing that. And you can see that, for instance, in this graph. What you see here is that Harvard researchers looked into all the breakthrough patents, so the disruptions that have taken place in the last years. And what you actually see here are 3 peaks, and the first one has to do with industrialization in agriculture mainly, but also electricity, so around the turn of that century. Then later on it was more about petrol and chemics. And the latest one you see has to do with information and digitization. And what you also can see here on this axis is that it's about the patents per 1,000 people. And in the meantime, of course, the population on our Earth has grown very quickly. So the third wave you see there is much and much greater than the first 2 you saw here. And we have to deal with that in our current time. So speed is increasing in that sense. And if you don't look at it very attentively, it just may be that some things come as a surprise to you while it's been developing all the time. Just an example you can see here. It's quite scary, actually, isn't it? At least I don't see myself doing this, but maybe that's me. So, if it's so difficult to use analysis to predict the future, how can you do it? Well, my conviction is, as Lincoln already said very long time ago, the best way to predict your future is to create it. And creating that future all has to do when you can either passively adapt yourself or proactively anticipate it, but you can also initiate change. And I think that the third category is something that we will focus on today. And organizations differ in the level of success and failure they have as a result from that. So just one question to you as an audience. Do you know what a rocker is? Who knows what a rocker is? No one? Okay. Who knows what the iTunes phone is? Ever heard of it? Well, let me just show you and then I'll explain what's happened here. Imagine yourself in 2005 at the famous Apple events, and Steve Jobs is standing there and he says, okay guys, one more thing. And let's look at that.
دیگه از من چی میخوای؟ من دوست دارم مرا.
Funk away, Beethoven.
Thanks for the lift. Ow! Like, whoa!
Watch it, dog!
Shut up!
Oh, and another one.
Biggie, no!
100 tunes in your phone, baby.
Hello, Moto.
I can tell you it was a disaster. It was a flop. And the funny thing is that in interviews with Steve Jobs or other Apple executives, they never talk about it. But they do talk about something else because they retried. And in 2007, as you all know, they introduced the iPhone. And you see what's happening because of that. Motorola and Nokia were the two players at the end of the last millennium. Ericsson entered the market. Motorola got some problems. And then, well, you see until 2005, nothing really important happens there. Some changes, new entrants. And then in 2007, you will see a yellow bar appear. And look at what happens to Motorola and Nokia and Ericsson, etc. There's the Apple bar. Ah. So the thing was that in 2005, Nokia was convinced that based on the flop that Rocker had, that smartphones wouldn't have very much relevance for the future, and that was why they they waited so long to come up with a smartphone themselves. But you all know that story, of course. So the question is, being future-proof, what does that take? And well, based on my research and based on what I have read otherwise, I think it's about 4 elements. The one pillar you see there is an internal pillar, and it's about you yourself. How careers are lengthening, they're becoming more dynamic, and what is it that you need to do to stay relevant until you decide yourself to stop working, instead of others deciding that for you. And the other element there is your organization. What do you have to do to become the winner in tomorrow's market? How can you create value in the future? That's a search you have to continuously follow. Then the external pillar is about, firstly, the environment. Of course, you know that it would be important to still have our beautiful planet in 100 years from now. And that means for each organization that you have at least to have a neutral impact on the environment, and preferably a positive one. Because if there's no external pillar, the left pillar isn't relevant at all, right? And secondly, the market. What you have to do there is find a balance in all the stakeholders that are relevant to you in the value they are seeking. So, for instance, if you look at online platforms for taxis or food delivery, great ideas, but my opinion on that is that currently there's a disbalance in the money the platforms are making from it and how the entrepreneurs that work with that platform are remunerated. I think that's not a sustainable model as it is currently. So I think that's important to become future-proof. And then the question, of course, is how? What do I need to do as an organization? Well, based on my research, again, my conclusion is that it's all about creating a learning organization. And for that purpose, you need to do 4 things, as you see here. It's about executing your daily business, but it's also about continuous improvement. It's also about renewal, innovation, and it's about change. And the pitfall is that many organizations only focus on the first one. They are totally absorbed in daily operations, and by doing so, you endanger your own future. I'd like to see that as a kite. A kite, as you of course know, is something that if you steer it, you have to continuously adapt it to the power and the direction of the wind. And in itself, it just uses natural resources to stay up in the air. So I think that's a nice picture to use for future-proofness. And of course, a kite needs sticks to hold the foil. And one of the sticks there is goals. It's what I mean by that is purpose. What makes your organization tick? What is it that you want to add to the world? You have to have that very clear to really use all the energy available in your organization. And secondly, it's about strategy. How are you going to achieve that? It's about thinking about, it's about defining your market. It's about determining your target segments, developing your positioning and propositions, how your customer journey is looking like, etc. Thirdly, what is relevant based on my research is leadership, in the sense that it's your personal leadership, so how do you want to develop yourself in the future, but it's also about motivating the people within your organization. How are you going to do that? I won't go into detail on that, but lastly, it's about means. I also think that people are in that sector. You could discuss on that, but it's also processes, tooling, etc. So everything you need to do the 4 things inside the kite, very importantly. Well, today we are focusing on innovation. And I think that you could say one thing about it. As Peter Paul already mentioned, there's no one best way to do it. So what next? Then, well, I think that it's about discovering, innovating your innovation, finding out what works for you and what doesn't. Experiment with it, right? So practice what you preach in that sense on a meta level. And one thing I want to point out at the end of my talk is that you need to be courageous. Don't be afraid to fail. I have listed some examples here of products, of concepts that have been developed just by accident. Someone was doing something totally different, or it went wrong, and something useful came out of it. I think the funniest example here is Viagra. My apologies for the example, but it was developed for heart problems. By testing it in the hospital, the nurses found out that there were side effects to that medicine, and that made them really curious. And then the producers decided to pivot their ideas about the medicine, and a few years later it was introduced to the market. And I think that was a very joyous day for men of a certain age, because the current revenues are estimated at about $6 billion. So that was a happy accident, so to say. If you're interested in that, I would strongly advise you to go to Sweden. Patrick knows about it. You have a museum of failure there. And it has a collection of failed innovations of courageous companies who had the guts to introduce something to the market, and it was a total disaster. And we can laugh about it now, but they should be very proud in trying, right? A funny example there is the Ford Edsel. It was a 1950s car, supposedly biggest mistake of Ford. It was very ambitiously designed and had all kinds of futuristic features. For instance, it was an automatic, and it had a button inside the steering wheel to change gears. So instead of tooting the horn, people put it in reverse, and the car started driving backwards, leading to all kind of unexpected situation on the road. But go and visit, I would say. And then finally, I want to round up with a confession. And my confession is that I used to have a secret pleasure. And my secret pleasure was that in the 1990s, when I attended university, mostly at 1 o'clock, I would return from the bar and sit down on my couch and turn on the television and watch Bob Ross. And it was a surreal experience, I can tell you that, having drunk a few beers too much. And it was amazing to see him produce the most horrible paintings, the most dull paintings that humankind have ever witnessed. But he was very enthusiastic about it, the old hippie. And he is my hero for one reason, because he wanted to encourage his viewers in becoming an amateur painter. And he always said, don't be afraid to make mistakes, to do it wrong. And he used a famous phrase for that. He said, we don't make mistakes, we just have happy little accidents. And with that, I want to end it and wish you many happy little accidents today.